Ridgeglen Estates had a reputation for calm, order, and trimmed hedges. To most, it looked like the perfect neighborhood, silent cul-de-sacs, polished driveways, and watchful neighbors. But to Mark McKinley, that silence had started to feel off. Ever since his daughter Lila was born, he'd learned to trust his instincts. And right now, they whispered that something wasn't right. Lila, 9 years old and sharp as a blade, had a habit of drawing the same birch tree near their porch. Every afternoon, despite her wheelchair and speech delay, she had a sense of focus that stunned anyone who watched her work. She could sit for hours, tuning out the world. But that day, her pencil stalled. Mark, working from his home office, glanced out the window just as Lila looked over her shoulder. Standing across the street, stiff and still, was Karen. Not a neighbor anymore, more like a permanent fixture of tension. Karen had served as Ridgeglen's HOA secretary for almost a decade. She kept records on everything: shrub height, garbage, can positions, porch light wattage, and now, for reasons Mark couldn't understand, she had fixated on his daughter. The first complaint came weeks ago, something about Lila's unregulated porch occupancy. Mark thought it was absurd. A child, sitting quietly with a sketchpad, was hardly a threat to neighborhood order. But Karen didn't drop it. She began pacing by their home during school hours, peering over their hedge, scribbling notes when Lila played outside. Then came the warning letters, typed in all caps and signed on behalf of the HOA board. Though no other board member ever came forward, Mark had tried to ignore her. He wanted peace, not confrontation. But that approach didn't work. Last week, Karen had shouted at Lila from across the street, telling her to remove herself from view. Mark confronted her calmly. She responded by accusing him of training his child to weaponize sympathy. That was the moment something shifted inside him. He installed a camera on the porch. That camera caught Karen returning at dusk with a measuring tape, inspecting the porch edge. She leaned close to the wheelchair, adjusted its position an inch, and photographed it. That was enough for Mark. He submitted the footage to the HOA board and requested a formal response. It never came. The next day, he noticed Karen's trash bins had shifted, perfectly aligned to give her a full view of his driveway. That afternoon, a delivery van pulled up. The driver paused, glanced around nervously, and handed Mark an envelope. Inside was a printed HOA violation: unregistered medical equipment on porch. Repeat offenses will result in legal intervention. It wasn't signed. The HOA seal at the bottom was MISALIGNED. Mark knew what that meant. Karen had gone rogue, but the street stayed quiet. Too quiet. That evening, Mark sat across from Lila at the dinner table. She looked up, eyes wide, and asked a question with only 3 words. "Am I wrong?" Mark didn't answer right away. He couldn't, because something in her tone made him wonder if Karen's whispering presence had begun to seed doubt. He promised her she wasn't, then walked to the window. Across the street, a light flickered behind Karen's curtain. Her silhouette stood still, like she was watching them back, not blinking, not moving. And then, just as Mark was about to close the blinds, he saw her lift something to her shoulder. A long, narrow object. He reached for his phone. Something was about to break. The next morning brought a false sense of calm. Birds sang, sprinklers clicked on. Ridgeglen Estates resumed its daily rhythm like nothing had happened. But Mark hadn't slept. He'd replayed the previous night's scene a dozen times. Karen at her window, something long and rigid resting on her shoulder. He couldn't say for certain it was a weapon, but it wasn't a camera. And it wasn't the first time she'd watched them. He checked the porch camera again. There was no footage of what she held, just grainy silhouettes, shadows stretching through the blinds. And the moment Mark dropped behind the couch, shielding Lila, by the time he got up to investigate, Karen's window had gone dark. Still, he didn't call the police. Not yet. He'd seen how Karen played the game, how quickly she could turn blame back on others. She knew the laws. She used the HOA like armor. If he made a move without proof, it might only make things worse. At noon, Mark returned from the mailbox, carrying another envelope. This time it was marked HOA emergency notice. Inside was a list of escalating fines: one for Lila's wheelchair, another for audio disturbances from minor child, and a third for improper surveillance device, referencing the porch camera. All were due in 48 hours. He checked the HOA website. No such notice was posted. The fines weren't recorded in the portal. These were forged again, but more calculated this time. She was testing how far she could go before the cracks showed. Later, that day, a neighbor named Jonah stopped Mark at the edge of the driveway. Jonah kept his voice low, eyes darting toward Karen's house. "She told me your daughter's been spying," he said. "Said she saw her with binoculars." "Lila can't hold binoculars," Mark said, jaw tightening. "I know," Jonah replied. "That's why I'm saying something. She's losing it." Mark didn't need the warning, but it confirmed he wasn't imagining things. Karen wasn't just harassing them now. She was lying to others, spreading paranoia like smoke through dry brush. That evening, Mark stayed close to Lila. She didn't draw. She didn't ask to go outside. She just sat in the living room, flipping through the corners of an unfinished sketchpad. Each page carried a half-formed image: a tree, a bird, a face, each one with edges she hadn't finished. Her hands trembled. "Do you want to go to the park tomorrow?" he asked. She shook her head. "Is it because of Karen?" Lila didn't answer, but the answer hung in the silence. Just after midnight, the porch camera picked up motion again. This time Karen wasn't hiding. She walked right up to their steps, pulled something from her coat, and wedged it between the storm door and the main entrance. Then she turned and walked away, slow and deliberate, glancing once over her shoulder. Mark waited until the light from her house shut off before opening the door. A package sat on the threshold, no label. He brought it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and cut it open. Inside was a baby monitor, turned on, still transmitting. Lila was already asleep. In her room, Mark stared at the glowing red light on the side of the monitor. Someone else had been listening. The soft hum of the baby monitor buzzed faintly in the kitchen. Mark didn't touch it again, he just stared at it. The glowing red light still active, blinking slowly like a warning. He had no baby. Lila hadn't used a monitor since she was 3. That meant it didn't belong to them. Karen had left it there intentionally. At 2 a.m. Mark unplugged the camera and set it inside a drawer lined with towels. If it was sending audio out, maybe it could be tracked. Maybe that was the point. But the implications curled around his thoughts like smoke. Karen wasn't just watching now. She was listening, maybe had been for days. The idea made his skin crawl. He checked the porch camera footage again, zooming in on her coat pocket. A wire trailed slightly from the corner earphones. Maybe she'd been listening in real time. By morning, Mark had made a quiet decision. He contacted a private security technician, someone he'd met briefly during a cybersecurity seminar 2 years earlier. The man arrived at noon and swept the house for hidden transmitters. They found 2, one near the living room speaker, one taped under the window ledge in Lila's room. Mark didn't tell Lila. That evening she asked to sit outside again. It surprised him. She rolled her chair to the same spot near the porch post, sketchbook balanced across her lap. The sky was pale orange. A single robin called from the hedge across the street. Karen stepped out of her home. She didn't shout this time. She just stood there, hands clasped behind her back, watching. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Karen moved closer to her mailbox, still staring. Then she tilted her head and began muttering. Mark couldn't hear it from the porch, but her mouth moved constantly, like reciting something memorized. She stepped to the edge of her curb, holding a paper cup, and then she dropped it. Lila flinched. Karen turned sharply and marched back inside. The silence afterward felt like the air had thinned. Night. Mark decided he needed to alert someone with authority. Not the HOA board, they'd ignored him. Not the police, not yet. He called the local precinct's community liaison and described the events plainly, without emotion. Illegal surveillance. Forged notices. A monitor. Implication of a weapon. The officer on the other end didn't respond right away. "You said the neighbor's name is Karen Lormer." "Yes. She's flagged in a prior call from your area." "For what?" "Nothing formal. Just a concern report filed by a neighbor who moved out last year. Said she claimed drones were spying on her lawn." "That tracks," Mark muttered. "We'll open a welfare inquiry," the officer said. "It's not much, but it'll put her on record." Mark hung up, unsure whether that would help or make things worse. That weekend, Mark invited Jonah and 2 other neighbors to his backyard. Quietly, casually, over coffee, he revealed what he'd found. The monitor, the forged letters, the recordings. Jonah shook his head. "She's unraveling. I heard her shouting at a bush yesterday. Said it was trespassing." One neighbor said Karen had pounded on her door, demanding to inspect her recycling bin for unauthorized materials. But what struck Mark was the final comment. "She told me your daughter was a symbol of infection." Her words, she said Lila was disrupting Ridgeglen's purity. That was no longer eccentricity. That was hate, focused, deliberate. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "She's preparing for something." And the problem was, no one knew what tonally that it was getting closer. Monday brought a stillness that felt unnatural. For the first time in weeks, Karen didn't appear at her window. Her porch light stayed off. No letters arrived, no calls, no strange noises during the night. It should have been a relief, but to Mark, it felt like the hour before a storm. Lila sensed it too. She didn't ask to go outside. She barely ate. Her drawings had changed, no longer soft lines and garden trees. She sketched fences now, thick ones, with WATCHTOWERS. At noon, Mark received a knock on the door. Not the doorbell, an intentional, slow knock. He opened it to find an unfamiliar man in a city utility jacket, standing stiffly, eyes scanning. Behind Mark's shoulder, waterline inspection. The man said, "Routine." Mark frowned. No notice had been posted. No email from the city. Before he could question it, Lila wheeled around the corner behind him, notebook in her lap. The man's eyes shifted to her. His jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he turned and walked briskly back to his truck. Mark followed him outside just in time to see Karen standing across the street, partially behind a bush, watching it all. Mark turned to the truck, no city seal, just a plain white vehicle. He picked up his phone by evening. He had confirmation. The city hadn't sent anyone. There was no inspection scheduled. Whoever the man was, he wasn't a public worker. and that meant Karen had involved someone else. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He paced, checked locks twice, and left the porch light on. He moved Leela's bed to the inner side of the house, and he kept his phone in hand. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the porch motion alert buzzed. Mark tapped the camera feed. Karen stood at the bottom of the steps again, but this time she wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside her, hooded, face obscured. Mark didn't wait. He called 911. But what happened next unfolded before the operator could finish her first sentence. A sound rang out sharp and unmistakable. A gunshot. The front porch would cracked, and glass from a lantern shattered outward. Mark dove toward Leela's room. He reached her just as another shot echoed, this time, further angled. She was awake, frozen. He pulled her into the hallway and pushed the dresser across the front door. Outside, headlights flicked on, someone shouted, and then tires screamed. By the time police arrived, the truck was gone, but Karen remained. Sitting, cross-legged in her lawn, rocking slightly, murmuring under her breath. A single pistol lay beside her. Officers drew weapons. A neighbor screamed. Floodlights blazed across the yard. Mark clutched Leela's hand as they watched from the bedroom window. Too far to hear the commands, but close enough to feel the energy shift. Karen stood, hands in the air, still talking to herself. When officers approached, she didn't run. She smiled. But when they asked her to drop to her knees, her voice changed. She shouted something incoherent. Then suddenly she sprinted. She didn't get far. Two officers tackled her into the flower bed, but even as they cuffed her, Mark noticed something odd. Karen wasn't struggling. She was laughing. And somewhere deep inside that laugh was a tone. Mark had never heard from her before. She had expected this, planned it. This wasn't the end. Sunlight was barely creeping over Ridgeglen's rooftops when the rumble of heavy tires filled the cul-de-sac. Mark stood at the window, holding his breath as three matte black vehicles rolled in one by one, their presence silencing the entire street. No sirens, no blaring lights, just the low sound of brakes and the clink of gear as armored agents stepped into view. SWAT, not regular patrol cars, not community officers. Tactical response. Two agents approached Mark's door, their movements controlled and alert. One tapped gently. When Mark opened, they identified themselves with clipped words and requested access to any home surveillance footage. He nodded silently, leading them to the living room and pulling up the saved video from the porch. The clip played without sound. Karen, the second figure, the flash, the sprint, her fall. An officer muttered to the other, "She didn't miss." Mark's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" The officer didn't elaborate, but the implications sank in. That shot aimed directly at the railing wasn't random. It had been a test, a warning, a demonstration. Karen's house was now marked off with yellow tape. Another team was moving through her property, slowly, methodically. Someone in a bomb suit walked the perimeter. That alone chilled Mark more than the gunfire. What had she been storing in there? By 10 a.m., the street was locked down. No cars allowed in or out. Neighbors were instructed to stay inside. A small command post was being set up in the community park. Someone whispered the word containment zone. Inside Karen's home, agents found shelves stacked with plastic bins labeled with neighbors' names. Mark's name had its own section, containing photos, maps of his house, and even old employment records. Leela's name was written underneath in red marker. Dozens of her drawings were photocopied and annotated with phrases like manipulation, pattern, and visual disruption tactic. They also found something more disturbing: emails printed out from HOA correspondence, messages between Karen and at least two board members. The phrases were subtle but telling. Keep pressing the visibility issue. She's testing boundaries. Use safety regulation. Angle Zeta violations are hard to push, but not impossible. If she doesn't break soon, we may need to escalate by invoking nuisance clauses. Mark read those lines in disbelief. This hadn't just been Karen's spiral. Others had helped her fuel it. One agent pulled Mark aside. She had homemade devices rigged in her basement. Booby traps. We think she was preparing for a siege. Mark sat on the porch steps, not speaking, just watching the house across the street as hazmat teams moved in. Lila sat beside him, silent, her sketchbook open on her lap but untouched. Then a loud thud echoed from Karen's backyard. A team had unearthed a sealed drum buried beneath her vegetable patch. When they cracked it open, a drone was inset, covered in notes and circuit diagrams. But it wasn't just a drone. It had been retrofitted with audio scanning equipment, something Karen clearly hadn't built on her own. A name appeared on the inside panel. M. O'Hare, Ridgeglen, HOA Tech. Mark stared at it. Another board member. Another quiet enabler. And suddenly, it was clear. Karen may have pulled the trigger, but she wasn't the only one holding the weapon. Karen's house was no longer just a home. It had become a crime scene, a puzzle box of paranoia and planning. The SWAT team's search stretched into the evening, uncovering more than just weapons and surveillance gear. Hidden behind a false panel in her garage wall was a row of file cabinets, unlabeled, locked. But not for long. By sundown, federal agents had joined the operation. Mark watched from his living room window as boxers were carried out under tarps. the neighborhood remained under quiet lockdown. Drones circled overhead, and plainclothes officials moved door to door asking questions, showing photos, comparing timelines. Mark received a knock just after midnight. A detective handed him a photo. It was one of Leela's drawings specifically. A tree with jagged branches reaching in every direction. Mark recognized it immediately. It was from 2 weeks ago. She marked this as a trigger pattern. The detective said. She believed it signaled something. Mark's stomach turned. Signaled what? That your daughter was part of a covert behavioral experiment. She thought you were using her to manipulate community sentiment. That the drawings were coded messages. Mark could barely respond. Karen had slipped into a different world entirely, and no one had stopped her descent. But more than her obsession with Leela, what startled investigators was how structured everything was. Karen hadn't acted alone. The files revealed years of HOA communications, some legitimate, others altered, but the tone remained steady, hostile toward any resident who didn't conform. In one message, the HOA vice president urged Karen to maintain uniformity by applying pressure to high-visibility cases. Another suggested encouraging early compliance by leveraging social shame. And buried deep in a folder marked Operational Noise was a printed report authored by Michael O'Hare, the same name found on the retrofitted drone. He wasn't just a board member, he'd once chaired the HOA's Technology and Security Subcommittee. In the report, he outlined plans to observe problematic residents through ambient sound tracking, describing it as a non-invasive method for community behavioral regulation. Karen had taken those ideas and built them into her reality. The files even included blueprints of surveillance zones, with key points of emotional agitation marked with red pins. Lila's porch was marked with a bold circle and labeled Zone A, symbolic disruption. Mark handed the report back to the officer without saying a word. Inside, Lila was asleep on the couch, her sketchbook closed for the first time in days. He sat beside her and didn't move for over an hour. The next morning, news vans lined the street. Word had spread. Helicopters circled once, then left. Ridgeglen had become a headline. Neighbors gathered quietly in driveways. Whispers passed from one family to the next. No one defended Karen now, but many were nervous for themselves, because as the files leaked, names began to surface. Board members, volunteers, even a former HOA president. Jonah stopped by with a folder under his arm. They gave me this, said I had the right to know. He opened it. Inside were photos, him, his wife, his dog. Captions scrawled underneath. Frequent pattern breakers. Untrustworthy lawn etiquette. Surveillance suggested. Mark didn't flinch. He knew what came next. This wasn't about one disturbed neighbor anymore. This was a system that had quietly given her permission, year after year. And now, someone had to answer for it. The Ridgeglen HOA held its emergency board meeting 3 days after the standoff. It wasn't held in the usual clubhouse that had been sealed by investigators. Instead, they gathered in a temporary canvas tent set up near the community tennis courts. The setting did nothing to hide the unease in the air. Mark didn't attend. He stayed at home with Lila, watching the live stream broadcast online. The room was filled, not with orderly silence, but with quiet anger. Residents had come with questions, demands, and the board, for the first time, seemed unsure of its own authority. Michael O'Hare, flanked by 2 HOA attorneys, opened the session with a short statement cold clip, avoiding direct acknowledgement of what had been uncovered. The events surrounding Ms. Lormer are deeply unfortunate and do not reflect the values of Ridgeglen. That was all he said. But the room didn't stay quiet. One by one, neighbors stood up. A mother recounted being fined for hanging her autistic son's therapy swing. A veteran told how he was warned about his wheelchair ramp's visual A family described how their Black Lives Matter sin led to community cohesion violations that mysteriously tripled their dues. Each story mirrored a pattern: quiet targeting, arbitrary enforcement, psychological wear-downs disguised as policy. Then someone brought up the files. You labeled my daughter a verbal agitator because she has Tourette's. One father said, you said she disturbed evening serenity. You fined us for that? O'Hare tried to respond, but was cut off. Another resident held up a page from the documents found in Karen's garage. It was an email from him referring to Lila as a symbolic destabilizer and urging Karen to neutralize her public image. There was no denying it anymore. The HOA board hadn't just ignored Karen, they had guided her. Mark watched from his couch. Holding the printout in his lap, Lila sat beside him, head resting on his shoulder. She didn't speak. She hadn't since the night of the shots. The silence was now something deeper. That afternoon, a class action complaint was filed against the Ridgeglen HOA. Mark was among the first to sign. So were over 30 other families. Allegations included harassment, psychological targeting, disability discrimination, and misuse of association power. More were expected to follow, but the legal process was slow. That night, something else happened. No one had expected. The Ridgeglen HOA website went offline. The next morning, their bylaws were found burned in a dumpster near the backlot of the clubhouse. Surveillance footage showed a man in a gray hoodie walking with a limp. Investigators suspected it was O'Hare, trying to destroy physical evidence, but it was too late. Digital copies of everything had already been shared with local media, and then, one final twist surfaced, hidden deep in Karen's files beneath documents. Beneath red-marked surveillance maps was a set of receipts, small, handwritten, and signed. One was a check, cashed by O'Hare himself, memo line, neighborhood compliance tools. Next to it, stapled, was a parts list, microphones, a frequency jet, a camera pen. Mark stared at the scanned image in disbelief. Oh, Hare hadn't just advised Karen, he'd funded her. 2 months passed. The houses along Ridgeglen's tree-lined avenue still stood, but something about them looked different, quieter, older, as if the place had aged in fast motion. A for-sale sign rested outside Karen's home, now boarded, its windows covered from the inside. No buyers had come. Mark walked the path to the community mailbox with Leela beside him, her sketchbook newly filled. She hadn't drawn since the incident until last week. Her first image back was of a single, broken chain falling from a tree. Branch. The lawsuits moved forward, piece by piece. 4 of the HOA board members resigned. O'Hare vanished the week after the burn pile was discovered. Authorities found his car parked 2 towns over, the keys still inside. No sign of him since. Karen remained in a secured psychiatric facility under federal observation. A grand jury had been convened. The agents hadn't said much, but from what Mark heard, it was only a matter of time before indictments dropped. Not just for her. The neighborhood, once obsessed with symmetry and silence, had begun changing, slowly, almost shyly. Children played, again without eyes watching from blinds. Wind chimes reappeared on porches. Garden beds bloomed untamed, but then came the letter, unmarked envelope, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, "What started here won't end with her. Compliance breeds order. Deviance invites rot." No name, no symbol, just that sentence. Mark turned it over twice. Nothing. He kept it from Leela, but the tension returned. Like a quiet leak in the walls, he brought it to the same investigator who'd handled the drone evidence. The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't look surprised. "Sometimes," he said, "people like her don't act alone. They act with permission. You pull out the weed, but the roots twist deep." They ran the note through analysis. No prints, no traceable ink. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. Later that week, a public meeting was held, but this one wasn't by the HOA. Ridgeglen no longer had one. The residents had voted unanimously to dissolve it. In its place, they formed a voluntary neighborhood group focused on rebuilding trust. No enforcement, no fines, no surveillance. Mark was asked to speak. He stepped up quietly, hands folded in front of him. "I never thought I'd have to protect my child from people who called themselves neighbors," he began. "But what happened here didn't start with gunfire. It started with whispers, with silence, with people who looked the other way." No one interrupted, not this time. He looked down at Leela in the front row. She had her sketchbook open. The page she held was blank, except for one single word at the top. "Begin." He ended with a promise. "If anyone here ever sees someone being cornered, being watched, being isolated, you don't ignore it. You step in. Because the last time we didn't, someone pulled the trigger." A quiet applause followed, not loud, not forced, just honest. Weeks later, Leela stood at the edge of Karen's yard, watching as a bulldozer tore the abandoned house down. In its place, the town approved a small garden, requested by Leela herself. No signs, no plaques, just a space for trees, open sky, and people. But beneath the soil, the past stayed buried, roots, still waiting, still coiled, waiting for silence to return. And this time, Ridgeglen had decided they wouldn't let it.